Welcome back to the Riichi Mahjong guide. So we've finally gotten to the strategy section of this video series, and I just want to preface this video by saying that we're not going to go into any advanced strategies. We're just going to cover some basic strategies that I think would be helpful for beginners. And there is a lot of stuff that we could cover, including efficiency theory, when to call, those types of things. But I'm not going to be covering that type of stuff in this series for the most part because there already is an excellent resource that you could use to learn more about that. It's an online book called Riichi Book 1 by Daina Chiba. It's an English publication that goes through several basic strategies, and that book covers pretty much everything I would want to cover on the series in a way that I can't possibly beat, and I'll just leave a link to that in the description below. And most of what we're going to cover in this video is covered in more detail in that book. But this is pretty important and not really that intuitive, so I thought I would cover it anyway. So in this video, we're going to be discussing some 4-tile shapes that beginners often undervalue. The first of which you should already be familiar. As you can see, we have these 6 different types of nobetan. This top row has 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, 7, 8, 9. The second row is 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5, 6, 7, 8. And the bottom row is 3, 4, 5, 6, and 4, 5, 6, 7. So when you're in Tenpai, a nobetan isn't the best shape that you could have, but it isn't anywhere near a bad shape because it's waiting on 2 different tiles, each of which you're only using 1, meaning that there are 6 tiles available for you to complete your hand. But if you're not at Tenpai quite yet and you're trying to get there, and you have a nobetan in your hand like that, you might think, oh, well, I already have a completed sequence and I'll just toss out that 1 extra tile because I already have a sequence. I don't need this 4th tile here. And from the standpoint of efficiency, that's a little bit misguided. For most nobetans, you could actually look at it like 2 Yanmen before you get to Tenpai. So for the 4 on the bottom here, you could just split it up and say, oh, this is a Yanmen on a 2-5, and this is a Yanmen on a 4-7. Or for instance, on this one, you could say, oh, this is a Yanmen for a 4-7, and this is a Yanmen for a 6-9. So having 4 consecutive tiles like this actually increases the number of tiles that you can accept into your hand and makes it easier to get to Tenpai with a better weight. Even if you get to Tenpai with your weight being a nobetan, it's quite an acceptable weight, so you shouldn't be rushing to dismantle a nobetan in your hand if there are other less useful tiles. You may think that it's just, oh, it's a sequence with 1 extra tile, but having that tile connected to your sequence opens up a lot of possibilities when developing your hand. Of course, the 2 nobetans on the top here that end with a terminal tile, those aren't nearly as useful as the other 4 types of nobetan, but it's still slightly better than having, for instance, a 1, 2, 3, and then a 4 of, let's say, a different suit. Because those aren't connected at all, it won't end up as a good weight if you're in Tenpai, if you just have that random 4-peen. Whereas if you have a 4-mon in this case, this could be a decent weight for your Tenpai. Specifically, the 2 nobetans that were in the bottom row, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 4, 5, 6, 7, can accept the most tiles and are the ones that give you the best chance of getting a 3-sided weight. So for instance, with the 3, 4, 5, 6, if we draw a 2, now we have a 3-sided weight on the 1, 4, and 7 mon. Or if we draw the 7, we have a 3-sided weight on the 2, 5, and 8 mon. Even if we just draw something in the middle, like a 5 mon here, we still completed a sequence and have a Yanmen left over, which is very strong. Or less ideally, we could end up drawing 1 tile that's a couple away from either end of the nobetan, but that still gives us a completed sequence plus a kanchan, which is not bad at all. So like I said, there's a lot more detail in the book, but I wanted to make sure that I mention how strong a nobetan can actually be when developing your hand. The next type of 4-tile shape that I wanted to talk about is a nakabukude. When you get to Tenpai, and if this is your weight, then that's actually a pretty terrible weight because it is a tanki weight where you're already using 2 of the available tiles in your hand. But before you get to Tenpai, you can view most nakabukude as 2 Yanmens, just like with a nobetan. So here we have a Yanmen for 2 and 5, and 3 and 6. But this pattern also can lend itself to the Yaku I Peiko. So for example, with this bottom pattern, 6, 7, 7, 8, if we draw an 8, we still have a Yanmen here waiting on the 6 and 9, but it also has the shape of an I Peiko in case we draw that additional 6. So you may think, oh, I have a sequence here, I can just toss this extra tile. But again, like with the Nobiton, that's also misguided. Unlike with a Nobiton, this is a terrible weight for when you're in Tenpai, but up until that point, or maybe until you're one away from Tenpai, a Nakabukude can help the development of your hand. And just like with a Nobiton, the Nakabukude that end with a terminal tile aren't really as good. Instead of being 2 Yanmens, it's just a Yanmen and a Penchan. So you have a Penchan for a 3-so, and then a Yanmen for a 1 and 4-so. So it still lends itself to I Peiko if you get lucky, but it's not going to be nearly as versatile as other Nakabukude patterns. And the last pattern we're going to talk about in this video is what the book refers to as a skipping shape, which is a pattern where you have a completed sequence, but then you have a tile that's a couple of spots away from the ends of the sequence. So even though this tile isn't directly connected to the sequence, it still has a little bit more value than just a random floating tile in another suit. The main reason why is because if, for instance, you were to draw that 4-pin to fit between the 3 and 5, this would become a 3-sided weight, which is very strong, but that's the ideal case. The way you should be looking at this as a Kanchan and a Yanmen, so you can accept the 4-pin, 5-pin, and 8-pin with this type of pattern. And like I said, the 4-pin would be ideal because it would give you a 3-sided weight. But even if you were to get the 5-pin or, for instance, the 8-pin, you would still have a completed sequence with a Kanchan left over, which is not bad. This pattern isn't as strong as the other 2 patterns we talked about today, but that tile that's just a couple away from your completed sequence has a little bit more value than another random floating tile. And one thing I wanted to mention is that these examples that have a completed sequence that end in a terminal, like 1, 2, 3 or 7, 8, 9, with the corresponding 5, this has the same type of pattern as a skipping shape, but it doesn't actually improve the number of tiles that you can accept or the eventual weight of the hand. For instance, if you were to draw a 6-pin with this bottom shape, you would still just have a completed sequence and a Yanmen. It won't be a 3-sided shape because it ends in the terminal. And that is exactly the same as if you would have just had a 5 floating in your hand and you drew a 6. It doesn't really improve the weight of your hand in any way to have that floating 5 next to your terminal. I mean, the 5 by itself is already pretty versatile. It's more versatile than just having a Penchan. But having a skipping shape like this doesn't actually help the development of your hand like other skipping shapes would. So in this video, we went over the basic concepts of these 3 different 4-tile weights that beginners tend to undervalue: a Nobiton, Nakabukude, and a skipping shape. Again, these patterns are covered in much more detail in Riichi Book 1 by Daina Chiba. And again, I will leave a link to that in the description below. It's a completely free online book, so there shouldn't be any reason why an aspiring Riichi Mahjong player like yourself shouldn't check it out. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below, and thank you so much for watching.